I've got 3 different video clips to show you in today's video of 3 different groups who attack Mark's gospel account. And the last clip in today's video is going to show you how even some of the best scholars in the world really don't know their Bible. Don't miss it. The first video clip I want to show you today comes from a group of professing Hebrew Israelites who will say things along the lines of Mark's gospel account is not as reliable as Matthew's gospel account. Listen to what they say.
Here's the problem. Matthew 15 is the eyewitness, not Mark.
Many people look at Mark's gospel account, Matthew's, look at all the gospel accounts, basically all 4 of them, and basically hold them on the same level because we believe that this is scripture which is inspired by God. The second point I want to add, even if we put inspiration on the shelf just for a second, is you are going to find when you look into stuff like this tradition which says that Mark wasn't some just unreliable second-hand person who had no proximity, right? The tradition, if you look into this, will say that Mark was ultimately documenting, was recounting things that he got from the leader of the apostles, the apostle Peter. Now let me give you 3 examples, and there's multiple more of these just for the record, and then I'll tell you why a professing Hebrew Israelite may try and take this approach before we move on to clip number 2. Now, the first sign I'll give you from Mark's gospel account, trying to analyze if Peter was actually dictating to Mark, is in the very first chapter. As we can see here in verse 16 from Mark chapter 1, Mark writes how Jesus was walking by the seaside in Galilee, and he saw Simon and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishers. Now, you may wonder why a verse like that will be so beneficial, but the fact of the matter is Peter is the first disciple out of the 12 mentioned in Mark's gospel account. That's actually quite significant first and foremost, and it's even more compounded when you think about the fact that there's no disambiguator in Simon Peter's name. For example, if someone turned around and said, I subscribe to Israel, one person could say, look, oh, this person is a supporter of the nation of Israel, but a disambiguate would be something like, I subscribe to Israel from in thy word. You get it? And that kind of thing with a name so prevalent in the first century as Simon showcases there's some sort of familiarity between Peter and Mark. Now, one thing that really stood out to me as I read through Mark's gospel account was something which starts in Mark chapter 3 verse 16. And again, this is when Jesus is bringing out the 12 disciples, and surprise, surprise, he mentions Peter first, which is like that in all of the gospel accounts, just for the record, that cover this, and Simon he's surnamed Peter. That's not why I'm saying, though, this is actually quite significant. The powerful thing about this is, from this point on in the narrative, once Jesus has changed his name, he's no longer referred to Simon, only in one situation. And this was actually alarming when it actually stood out to me. In Mark chapter 14, verse 37, bearing in mind what I just told you, and he comes, Jesus that is, and finds the disciples sleeping. And he says unto Peter, even the narrative is calling him Peter, notice that. But notice what Jesus says. Simon, sleepest thou? Could you not watch for just 1 hour? And as I was reading this, I was thinking to myself, wow, like Jesus changed his name to Peter from Simon, and throughout the gospel accounts, you don't see him being called Simon. But at this particular point, even the fact that Mark wrote this and said Peter, and then Jesus turns around and calls him Simon. I obviously can't prove this, but the thought I had in my head was maybe because Peter was missing the mark at this particular point, Jesus was highlighting that, look, you're Simon right now when you're supposed to be the rock, Peter. Now, the next example from Mark's gospel account, which does showcase some sort of relationship to Peter personally, is in Mark chapter 6 we can look at. And this is when Jesus is walking on the water. We're going to look at just 2 verses, Mark chapter 6 verse 50 to 51. And notice what it says. They all saw him, all of them, and they were troubled. And immediately he talked with them and said unto them, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And he went up unto them into the ship, and the wind ceased, and they were sore amazed in themselves beyond measure, and wondered. Now, the powerful thing about a situation like this is there is a big omission in this particular account. This account is all talking about all of them. All of them were amazed, all of them were distressed and were wondering. But the big omission from this account is the fact that Peter actually walked on the water. That is picked up in another gospel account, but Mark decided to omit that And you'll generally hear people talk about the fact that because this was an embarrassing thing in regards to Peter, Mark, who was taken from Peter and writing this stuff down, was trying to protect the person who's ultimately giving him the insights. Before we move on to the second clip in today's video, which is something you probably hear over and over again and something which comes up time and time again, the reason a professing Hebrew Israelite will try to water down Mark's gospel account and try to limit the strength and the power of the gospel account is because there are clearly things in this gospel account which go against, which destroy the beliefs that they ultimately hold to. Now, the second video clip I want to show you today comes from people who don't hold the Bible in any sort of high esteem, don't preach from it. And we're going to talk about Muslims. Muslims love to basically attack the Gospel of Mark and basically say how there was a clear development amongst the Gospel writers, and because Mark's Gospel was the first Gospel account, Jesus really isn't God or divine in this Gospel account. I'll play this clip right now from popular Muslim apologist Dr. Ali, and listen to what he says.
Coming to major matters like divinity, I've already indicated that there is a development among the Gospels where, for example, in the last of the four Gospels, Jesus is now called the divine Logos, who existed with God from all eternity. Why isn't a statement like this in the earlier Gospels?
So the only problem with what Dr. Ali just said there is that isn't actually true to Mark's Gospel account, and we can see this right early on as soon as we get into the Gospel account. Look at this from Mark chapter 1. And we can just look at the first 3 verses. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. As it is written in the prophets, behold, I send my messenger before thy face, which shall prepare the way before thee. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare ye the way of the Lord, make his paths straight. The problem with a Muslim trying to make this argument is, as soon as we get into Mark's gospel account, the first 3 lines are already allusions to Malachi chapter 3 verse 1 and Isaiah chapter 40, 2 passages which clearly and categorically showcase that there would be a messenger who would prepare the way for God who was ultimately coming. And Mark goes on to talk about how this messenger was John the Baptist, and John the Baptist was preparing the way for Jesus, who was ultimately the Lord in the flesh. And the reason Muslims will basically try and tear down Mark's gospel account is because they lean on scholarship which says Mark was the first gospel account. So they want Jesus to be weak and not anything near divine in that gospel account to try and showcase that, look, you know what, it's only John who talks about what Jesus as divine. The third example in today's video we're going to look at comes from a very popular unbeliever who makes the claim that Jesus never claimed to be God in Mark's gospel account. This is popular Bible critic Dr. Bart Erhman, and listen to what he has to say.
If Jesus did go around calling himself a divine being, if that really happened, as John says, it happened, and it's the major teaching of Jesus in John. If that's what happened, why isn't it in Mark or Q?
So just like the 2 previous examples in today's video, we'll read through Mark's gospel account and see what we can find. And I'll just give you 2 examples. The first example is something which is quite clear, and this comes from Mark chapter 2 verse 27 to 28. And notice what Jesus says here. And Jesus said unto them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not the man for the Sabbath. And notice what he says here, which is just golden. He says, therefore the Son of Man, who's speaking about himself, is Lord also of the Sabbath. Now, according to Genesis chapter 2, God is the one who was the Lord of the Sabbath, the one who instituted, the one who established, who created the Sabbath. So for Jesus to say these lines so early on in Mark's gospel account, who is Jesus claiming to be? And Jesus calling himself the Son of Man and the Lord of the Sabbath shouldn't surprise us, because in Mark's gospel account as well, Jesus highlights how he believes he is the Son of Man who would receive divine worship, which is only able to be given to God. Look at Mark chapter 14 verse 61 to 62 here, and this is where the high priest is questioning Jesus before his crucifixion. He says, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am, and ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power, coming in the clouds of heaven. I'll just stick to the last part of that verse, which is in reference to Daniel chapter 7, where the Son of Man is taken to the Ancient of Days, and he's given a kingdom and dominion and glory, and all people, all nations will worship him. So if Jesus is calling himself the Lord of the Sabbath, and Jesus is expecting divine worship only supposed to be given to God, why would even a popular Bible scholar like Dr. Bart Erhman make such a claim when Mark's Gospel account clearly identifies these things? And considering we ended with Bart Erhman in today's video, he also says that these two verses right here should make you question your faith.